The Kremlin is freaking out and shouting about a conspiracy. Revolution in Belarus. Lukashenko is finally being overthrown. Shouts can be heard in the corridors of power in Moscow. Here we go. The USA, Poland, Germany, and Britain are on the list of enemies. Moscow is afraid of losing Minsk and is panicking ahead of the elections. Meanwhile, Lukashenko himself is plunging the capital into darkness. With a single order, the city is left without power. The streetlights are off, people are walking blindly, I see, the officials are making excuses. The dictatorship is afraid and is pressing every lever it can. Darkness and paranoia, the regimes are coming apart at the seams. All this and more coming up, don't miss it. Hello, I'm Solomia Dolik. This is Ukraine Today and the latest events. The Kremlin is once again talking about a Western conspiracy, this time around Belarus. The agencies of the US, UK, Poland and Germany are preparing a new attempt to change the constitutional order in Belarus. This was loudly announced by the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation. In Moscow, they claim that the so-called Western democratizers have allegedly set their sights on Minsk once again and are preparing a scenario to destabilize the country. According to the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the main goal of the West is to weaken the ties between Belarus and Russia within the so-called Union State and to complicate the achievement of its objectives. Of the special military operation, that is the war against Ukraine. The intelligence service claims that the West is planning to conduct a thorough inventory of Belarusian opposition personnel in order to use them for subversive activities. Moreover, the Kremlin insists that the pool of people angry at Lukashenko is being prepared, with an eye on the 2030 presidential elections. Separately, the statement says, it refers to the alleged search within Belarusian society for new liberal activists who are supposed to become the driving force of the so-called color revolution scenario. At the same time, Russian intelligence has not forgotten about the old opponents of the regime either.
The fugitives who have settled in Lithuania and Poland, led by Tikhanovskaya, have demonstrated their complete powerlessness in recent years to have any influence at all on the processes in their home country.
The SVR of the Russian Federation also claims that the West supposedly fails to take into account that after the events of 2020, Belarusian society has been inoculated against attempts to destabilize the situation in the country. In reality, however, Moscow is once again painting a familiar picture. All protests are external, and all dissenters are tools of the West. All elections are under the threat of a color revolution. And the closer it gets to new political cycles, the louder these claims become. In the Kremlin, statements about conspiracies, scenarios, and enemies all around are being voiced. And while in Moscow they are talking about Western scenarios, color revolutions, and liberal enthusiasts, in Belarus itself, the regime is demonstrating what true stability looks like, Lukashenko style. Minsk. One decree in darkness and the capital is literally blinded. The self-proclaimed president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, plunged Minsk into darkness with his decision. After an emotional meeting with officials, the street lighting in the capital simply disappeared.
This is complete lawlessness. And how are children supposed to walk home from school in such darkness? Even I'm scared myself.
It all started with irritation. Lukashenko was outraged that the streetlights were being turned on too early, saying it was wasteful and an unnecessary expense for the budget. And he didn't hold back in his statements.
What infuriates and annoys me is that yesterday at 6 p.m. the entire Minsk region was lit up. The lights are on, and this is typical for everyone. Blame yourselves. You'll be paying out of your own pocket. All the streetlights are on. Why? By 7:30 in the morning, you can already turn off the streetlights. Especially now, when there's plenty of daylight. No, all the lights are still on.
Lukashenko ordered that the streetlights not be turned on before 7 or 8 p.m. And to turn them off no later than this morning. And the system responded literally the very next day. But the streetlights were never turned on. The city started to get dark right before our eyes. People were coming home almost by feel. The townspeople were outraged. A city without light, without heat, and without warning. The situation was reported by Belarusian outlets Zerkalo and Minskaya Pravda. At the same time, Lukashenko kept pressuring the officials.
Just think, for 4 to 5 hours the whole country is lit up. How much money are we spending? These are your methods. You've lost your minds.
Now the officials are making excuses. At the Ministry of Energy, the Belarusians say that the president's words were simply taken too literally.
The head of state was scolding. Well, not exactly scolding, but holding a meeting with the government where he criticized the fact that the lights were on in the Minsk region. And it's kind of clear why there's no need to turn on the streetlights too early there. But as I understand it, at different levels, the executors took the head of state's words very literally. And overall, they went overboard.
In the Minsk city administration, the situation was called a one-time action, but the fact remains the fact. One phrase from Lukashenko and the capital of the country was left without light. A city in darkness as a symbol of a country where even the streetlights are turned on at the whim of a single person. Urgently, this is the end. They have come for Lukashenko. Minsk is exploding from within. Ukraine lights the match of justice and extends a hand to the opposition. A historic meeting between Zelensky and Tikhanovskaya. A clear signal that can no longer be hidden. Belarus is preparing for radical changes. The dictatorship is being uprooted. A coup that will set everything in its place. Kyiv has pressed the button. First details. Don't miss it.
Ukraine has set its sights on Belarus. For the first time in years of war, Kyiv is not just talking about a democratic Belarus, but is starting to speak with it directly. On January 25th in Vilnius, President Volodymyr Zelensky held a full-fledged meeting with Sviatlana Tikhanovskaya, head of the United Transitional Cabinet of Belarus, effectively the government in exile.
This was a political, well-thought-out move that was meant to be met. We are with you. Everyone who wants Belarus to be democratic, and that is what the regime in Minsk needed to hear.
For a long time, contacts with the democratic opposition of Belarus were effectively blocked. The office of the President of Ukraine proceeded from a simple logic. Do not touch Lukashenko, so as not to provoke him into even more active participation in the war against Ukraine. It was believed that a cautious distance would allow for at least the illusion of neutrality to be maintained, Minsk. But the illusion was shattered. Belarus has become an almost complete launching pad for the Russian invasion. Its territory is being used to station Russian troops and weapons. And Lukashenko himself is becoming ever more deeply entangled in military and political dependence on the Kremlin.
For now, unfortunately, Lukashenko's white spitz has more rights than the people of Belarus. There was a chance in 2020 to change this, and I am sure there will be another chance. But back then, there simply wasn't enough support for the Belarusians. And now we all feel just how much more difficult, how much more costly, how much more dangerous it has become for everyone because of Belarus's dependence on Moscow.
But behind the Vilnius meeting stands not only a reassessment of the past, but also a calculation for the future. Right now, the father is getting a real chance to come out of international isolation. In the West, there are increasingly frequent signals about the possible partial lifting of sanctions and Minsk's return to diplomatic formats, all under the guise of peace initiatives and regional stabilization. For Ukraine, such a scenario is dangerous. The legitimization of Lukashenko means the preservation of the Russian military bridgehead near the northern borders and an attempt to freeze Belarus, in the role of the Kremlin's vassal for years to come.
Operator of Russian Shahed drones. They operate against Ukraine, including from the territory of Belarus. The coordination for strikes is maintained from Belarusian territory. Russia uses Belarus as a testing ground to blackmail Europe and the world. By its henchmen, the manufacturing industry in Belarus actively works for Russia's ongoing war. And these deep trade ties help Putin buy the specific components he needs to build a significant threat against all of us today.
That's why Kyiv is taking a preemptive step. According to media reports, Zelensky and Tikhanovskaya discussed specific mechanisms for deepening cooperation, from restoring a separate Belarusian direction in Ukrainian diplomacy to legal steps that could finally close off Lukashenko's path to international rehabilitation. This includes in particular the possible initiation of international criminal prosecution. For Ukraine, this is a way to eliminate the grey corridor of Russian influence near its borders.
I want to address the people of Belarus separately. You are a European people who will stand together with all our nations in unity. Ours in a free Europe, a peaceful Europe, a strong Europe. And you cannot be erased.
And while the West hesitates, the Russians are increasingly absorbing the Belarusians. Just 40 kilometers from the border with Ukraine, in the Homel region, a new training ground is being built in front of Yakimivka railway station. The main construction work is scheduled for 2027 to 2028, with funding of $52.50 and $86 million, respectively. At the same time, construction continues on a military town near the village of Prybor in the Homel district, where a new airborne assault brigade is planned to be stationed.
The placement of such a base is a direct threat to Ukraine, and this is a signal to us that we must also prepare for possible scenarios of an offensive from Russia through Belarus, and possibly the involvement of Belarusians in this process.
It seems that for the first time in years, Belarusians have a real opportunity to break the chains of Putin's regime and regain their freedom. To stand up to Moscow, determine their own future, and build a Belarus that will be part of a free and democratic Europe.
Ukraine has taken on such neighbors. Zelensky shakes hands with the Belarusian opposition. There is no coup brewing in Minsk. Lukashenko is being swept away by the tide of events. The dictatorship is losing its grip, and Moscow is getting nervous. Kyiv extends a hand to yet another country. Now they are preparing to liberate Transnistria from Putin's yoke. Shocking details will not be missed. Coming up.
Lukashenko, the so-called president, is not recognized as legitimate by Ukraine, just like other EU countries. Modern Belarus has lost its sovereignty and has turned into a governorate of Russia. The Lukashenko regime and Lukashenko himself must be held accountable for their complicity in Russian aggression. Kyiv's position regarding its neighbors was voiced in a major interview with European Pravda by the head of the armed forces of Ukraine, Andriy Sybiha.
We believe that the time will come when Belarus, a democratic Belarus, will become the fourth participant in the Lublin Triangle. Now I have received instructions from the president to appoint a special representative, and in the near future I will submit a candidate for consideration. We are still determining the title of this position, but it will be an official authorized to maintain contacts with the democratic Belarusian forces.
Just recently, during a visit to Lithuania, Volodymyr Zelensky's team essentially made a series of symbolic moves. For the first time, they publicly established contact with the so-called government in exile. Under the gaze of television cameras, the Ukrainian president met with the head of the United Transitional Cabinet of Belarus, Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya. A third of the speech delivered by the Ukrainian president in Lithuania was dedicated to Belarus. On Tsikhanouskaya's page describing the meeting, there was praise not only for Zelensky, but also for Kirilo Budanov. This was in the context of the Ukrainian special services assisting in the release of Belarusian political prisoners in mid-December. In 2025, the Ukrainian president invited Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya to Kyiv. When exactly the visit will take place is still unknown. This
was a political, well-thought-out layer that was meant to be felt. We, those of us who want the visit to be democratic, and what was meant to be felt. The regime in Minsk.
But not only the Vilnius meeting. Alarming bells for the regime in Minsk rang out from the heart of Kyiv. On the 11th anniversary of the death of Belarusian Mikhail Zhizniewski, one of the first to die on the Maidan in 2014, a march of Belarusians took place in the center of the Ukrainian capital in memory of Mikhail and all compatriots who defended Ukraine's freedom from Russian occupiers. Mikhail Zhizniewski
is the greatest hero of Troika. Glory, glory, glory.
In addition, the SBU announced the exposure of a KGB agent who had been recruited by Belarusian special services back in 2015. The woman worked at one of Putin's godfather's TV channels, and in 2020 she was sent to Ukraine again, where she got a job at one of the national media outlets. The SBU released fragments of conversations between the detainee and her Belarusian handlers, as well as her attempts to recruit a serviceman of the Ukrainian Defense Forces.
This isn't the KGB, this is a higher authority. No one else in this life will touch me. Personally, that's good for me. Absolutely no one will touch you. This specific example that we are currently looking at right here serves as a very clear and perfect illustration of the point I am trying to make. This is actually just, you see.
This is my personal business. You're free to go. That's how it works. With 10 years experience, you should know this by now.
The SBU made it clear to Minsk that they know about the agent's trips to Europe, her assignments in Ukraine, and that the majority of her reports are fake.
SBU and GUR officers began a long-term operational game with the Belarusian agent, which not only allowed them to document her every move, but also to regularly misinform the Belarusian special service through her.
The Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, without going into details, clarifies that new elements of support for Russian aggression are currently being recorded in Belarus. The Ukrainian side documents each episode legally in order to raise the issue of imposing sanctions in the future. Recently, the Ukrainian authorities have been speaking out more and more loudly, not only about the future of Belarus, but also of Moldova. The head of Ukrainian diplomacy, when asked whether Kyiv is considering providing military assistance to its neighbors for the deoccupation of Transnistria, did not make any announcements. This remains the right of Chisinau. At the same time, both countries are becoming increasingly aware that the Russian troops on this territory pose a threat to the national security of both Moldova and Ukraine.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
A sensational shock. NATO is shaken by this. Belarus is on standby. Hundreds of thousands of troops are pressing at the alliance's border. Putin is drowning in statements. The West is gathering all its forces together. The beginning of a new fierce confrontation. This has been warned about for a long time. Hybrid war. Moscow has already set its traps. It seems a strike is inevitable. Europe is raising its army. What will happen next? We'll find out in just a moment. Russia is preparing to attack NATO and will be preparing for this on the territory of Belarus. As Bundestag member Roderick Kiesewetter stated, Russia has already deployed 2 army corps on the territory of Belarus to strike NATO countries.
Thanks to the military economy, Putin is training hundreds of thousands of soldiers who are not being used in Ukraine at all.
Even before attacking Ukraine, Putin claimed that no one was going to attack anyone. The dictator speaks about attacking NATO in the same way.
Well, does any of you actually believe that Russia is preparing to attack NATO? What is this? And we are supposedly going to attack NATO, right? What kind of nonsense is this?
That's why, as experts say, you should take everything coming out of the Kremlin with a grain of salt, divide it by 10, and not listen to their words, but watch their actions.
Well, first of all, there are the drone flights. They're testing how Europe will respond to drone attacks. They are entering the airspace, targeting aircraft. Not for long, not for an extended period, but they do enter. This happened over Estonia, they flew over Finland as well. An increase, a concentration of troops, a build-up. In any case, the number of Russian troops in Belarus, as well as Russian Belarusian forces, will increase.
Military exercises, an increase in Russia's army budget, preparation of Russian legislation for martial law and propaganda. Everything points to the fact that Putin is preparing for something bigger.
But remember what Peskov said 2 days before. He is President Putin's advisor. 2 days before the attack, before the start of the so-called special military operation, he said that no one was planning to attack anyone. Just 2 days before it began. So of course we can only analyze the signs of what might happen. But all European analysts, as well as those from NATO countries, agree that if the Russians can, they will most likely initiate military action against European countries, the Baltic states, possibly Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and maybe Finland, while Belarus borders Lithuania and Poland. So most likely these will be attacks coming from Belarus. Although, for example, Estonia borders the Russian Federation.
Ukrainian intelligence has repeatedly stated that Ukraine is only the first stage for Putin. Moreover, recently Putin has started personally blaming Europe for the war in Ukraine and publicly insulting Europeans.
It wasn't us. It was in 2022 that the war began. It was the destructive forces in Ukraine with the support of the West that unleashed this war. And the European piglets and their allies. At the same time, the previous administration of the United States actively participated in this coordinated effort, driven by the hope of profiting significantly from the total collapse of our country.
Lukashenko became bolder since the territory of his country serves as a staging ground for attacks. He stated that the continuation of the war in Ukraine threatens a global nuclear conflict and the complete destruction of Ukraine. And he gave advice to everyone who lives next to a sleeping bear.
Well, if you live next to this sleeping bear, then don't wake it up. Find a normal relationship so you can coexist.
Back in October, Finland's defense minister Antti Häkkänen warned that Russia is building up military power near the EU borders. and is preparing for a second phase of aggression which will threaten NATO even after the war in Ukraine ends. The minister noted the active modernization of the Russian army and the redeployment of units to the alliance's border, which indicates the Kremlin's long-term aggressive intentions against Europe. And Bundestag member Kiesewetter states that, in his opinion, the years 2026 to 2027 will be critical. Experts are saying the same thing.
Most likely, military actions will begin, if not next year, then within a year at most against European countries. Only they will take on a hybrid and unexpected nature for many Europeans. Character from hybrid warfare. This is what was written at least 10 years ago, if not more. It was a scientific work, not just some article, but by their commander, the chief of the general staff. That hybrid war begins in such a way that the population doesn't understand, and neither do the armed forces or the leadership. Is this already a war or not yet a war? Most likely there will be some little green men. It will be some kind of people's self-defense. So-called somewhere there in Estonia. There will be some other actions as well. Unknown drones and so on.
Moreover, as personally stated by the Russian Minister of Defense, Belousov, this is supposedly the case. NATO is preparing for a military confrontation with Russia already at the threshold of the 2030s?
All this indicates that NATO is preparing for a military clash with Russia.
And this means that propaganda in Russia has already begun, and the Kremlin is trying to convince both Russians and the whole world that it wasn't them who started it, but Europe, and that Russia is supposedly being forced into this. Everything is just like it was before the start of the full-scale war in Ukraine. Previously, Europe didn't really believe in such a scenario, but the more they felt aggression on their own territories, the more they started to prepare. They became afraid.
Well, it's waking up. Europe, 4 years weren't enough. We were shouting at the top of our lungs saying, look, Russia won't stop, it will keep going further. But they really just didn't want to come out from under their blankets. Kids hide under the blanket when they're scared. Or maybe it's just a relatively warm bath. Or maybe they just didn't want to. Now they do want to, whether they like it or not. Now they have to do something because the threat is already tangible, not just real. When you say real, a person doesn't feel it yet, they still don't understand. But when a person starts to understand, to feel that something is about to hit them, that's when it gets scary, that's when action begins. Well, thank God that at least in this way, at least they're starting to do something.
Europeans have already started to strengthen their defenses, allocating more budget to the military-industrial complex, preparing people for war. At the same time, they have started to increase their support for Ukraine. After all, they understand that Ukraine already knows how to fight and is a reliable shield for NATO. But even so, in Europe, they still hope that if peace is achieved in Ukraine, Putin will not go any further. The countries that border Russia are especially tense. Finland warns that Russia will move troops to the NATO borders even if a peace agreement is signed in Ukraine. Russia remains a threat. Finland has already hosted the first summit of 8 eastern flank countries that have a sea or land corridor with Russia and Belarus. For Europe, it is now important to be ready for self-defense as the US is beginning to withdraw from the continent and the tense situation is only escalating. And what do you think about these actions? Share your opinion in the comments, hit like under the video, and follow the main news together with me. More to come. See you in the next segment.